Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Elto wash processed Ethiopia from Oma Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Oma, based out of Taihang, Hong Kong, and this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the El Brahe, a wash processed Colombian coffee. And as I've said in the past, I usually like reviewing one washed and one non-washed offering when trying out a new coffee roaster for the first time. But this time I did decide to play it a little safe, as we hadn't reviewed too many El Brahe coffees recently. And in addition to that, this coffee did catch my interest given that it is an Ethiopian pea berry. So for that reason, the only two coffees we are reviewing from this coffee roaster are washed coffees. But we'll go ahead and see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 55. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. We did mention in our previous Oma review that they are on the lighter side of things, and this one did give us that perception as well, as this coffee certainly skewed in that direction. As I kind of mentioned, they're not quite as light as some of the other Asian coffee roasters we've had, but those were the extremely light coffee roasters, as this one definitely still skews lighter than the majority of Asian coffee roasters we've reviewed on this channel in the past. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 26. First impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was offering some nice intensity to it with excellent clarity, as it has a very pronounced stone fruit component to go with a slightly more delicate base. Plenty of florals and citrus, so a pretty nice and straightforward start to this one. And usually when it comes to wash processed Ethiopian coffees, the biggest thing I'm looking for on that first try is just how much intensity there is to the coffee. And given that both the coffees we had from Oma had plenty of intensity right from the start, that was definitely another positive experience with this one. Day 29, through the Chemex, and the coffee is a bit more floral forward this time, as it's offering much more of a honeysuckle-like feel, and the jasmine aspect being nearly as abundant. More clear, sugary stone fruits do remain with some of the more pronounced characteristics to this one, as it's very Ethiopian-like, as you'd fully expect. We move on to day 32, as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee was the best it had been up to this point, as it does continue to perform above expectations for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, mostly due to the fact that it offers great intensity, including the previously mentioned sugary stone fruits, as there's an abundance of white peach being the most pronounced it has been up to this point. In addition to that, just some excellent fruit intensity all around, so certainly enjoying these first couple of experiences with this one. Day 35 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and we mentioned in the El Brahe review that I didn't know that Oma actually had a brew guide which did skew on the slightly lower extraction side of things. But we opted to go the other direction, and there were mixed results, as it's slightly all over the board this time around relative to the earlier days. A bit more tea-like this time with a moderately muddling herbality to it. In addition to that, some stronger florals with a moderate intermediary and we'll say defined white peach, but at the same time, the overall experience on this day was just kind of a bit more mixed. We move on to day 38, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's a standout day to this point, as it's overly ripe in terms of the peachiness, and it's pretty well defined, as it's offering some of the best clarity, definition, and intensity to this point, as that peach component is something that I'm continuing to focus on, especially given that there was a much sweeter aspect to it. In addition to that, some prominent floral qualities and the complementary sweet orange, so as a result, this was certainly the best day we'd experienced of this coffee up to this point. Day 41. Through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee does continue to offer a peach forward experience, as it has some very nice intensity once again for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, and I found myself going back to that note a lot, mostly because I really wanted to highlight and bring home the point that this coffee really just had some nice intensity in general. Usually that's my biggest grievance and issue with washed Ethiopian coffees, is that they can be a little tame at times. Better all around, as the coffee does appear to be improving, so I was happy with that. We move on to day 44, as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's a nice day of this coffee once again, as it's a bit more white peach forward with a better level of clarity and definition to it. Better balanced, as the intensity and flavor separation does continue to improve with a very well-defined citric sweetness to it. It just feels notably improved in general, so that's why we went back to it one more time. Though truth be told, given the higher extraction adjustments working as well as they did, I feel like however we brewed this coffee with this brew method was yielding some extremely positive results, As on day 47, we opted to go back to the Chemex, and there was a slight bit of inconsistency to this coffee, as it wasn't quite as good as the previous day, hinting that it might be a bit sensitive to the brew in general, which does kind of go counter to what we had previously mentioned. But that being said, this is the first time and the anomaly that we've experienced for this coffee. It does open up as it cools down, but it was a bit generic off brew. On the cool down, it did offer a slightly berry grape quality to go with that very prominent peachiness, citrus, floral, and tea-like quality to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And I do know that this tasting wheel actually looks extremely similar to the El Obraje, but let's go ahead and go through it. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. This one I would say was equally, if not cleaner actually, than that El Obraje, mostly because the definition to a lot of the stone fruit qualities in this one were better defined. In addition to that, I would say that the florality was also a bit better defined to this coffee. So level 4 is where we opted to put it, and even then I would say it's on the slightly higher side of that level 4, especially given the overall intensity of this coffee. Finish, level 4. I have to say that this one did skew a bit more on the tea-like side of things within the finish a lot of the time. Either that or a little bit more of a floral tea-like finish to it, and that's not necessarily something that I was overly happy with, mostly because the stone fruits were so prominent and pronounced, but that was usually at the forefront of this coffee, where it did seem to trail off a bit more into those tea-like qualities at the end. That being said, an abundance of qualities within that finish. Pretty intense, as you can see the sweetness also scoring there at that level 4. And the best part of this coffee was the fruit sweetness that was present, especially given that it was skewing in the sugary stone fruit-like sense. They do have white peach listed on here, though I could also see plenty of the other yellow peach qualities to it, as it just did seem to skew a lot more on the sugary side of things in general with that specific note. We move on to the florality, level 4, and just like with the El Obraje, the two floral qualities I picked up from this coffee was the honeysuckle and jasmine-like aspects to it. Would say that the jasmine, once again, was a bit better defined as this coffee did go on. Honeysuckle a bit more pronounced earlier on, and I think that was attributed to the sweeter qualities that was present within this one. So definitely a sweeter florality within this coffee. We move on to the citrus fruit, level 4, and I feel like they had something a little different on here. I could have that wrong, but maybe something like a blood orange, as this one wasn't quite as lemon dominant as the El Obraje, which was certainly a saving grace to me, given that the citrus fruit, while they're both scoring at the level 4, they're presenting in different ways, and for that reason I enjoyed the citric qualities much more in this one, especially given that they weren't quite as dominant relative to the other fruit quality in this coffee, which was that stone fruit. Level 4, very well defined, exceptional. I've been discussing that right from the onset of this coffee. I believe that this one has a white peach note listed on here, and it makes a lot of sense given just how clean and defined it was within this coffee. We move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the acidity, level 3. Same thing once again. That's one of the few differences that we did have from, another one of the similarities that we had from the El Obraje is that all of the top of that tasting wheel did score the same: cleanliness, finish, sweetness, acidity, florality. So that's another example of that, as this coffee wasn't quite as bright as maybe the profile of this coffee would insinuate. And one big thing I must say about it is that it wasn't as close to the level 4 as the El Obraje. That one offered a bit more brightness, and I think that's because it was a little bit more citric forward in general. Even then, level 3 is where we opted to put it. Berry fruit, level 3, for the same reason. There is a slight berry-like quality to it, mostly in that grape-like sense, which it's tricky at times when the only two coffees you picked up from a coffee roaster are so similar, and I mentioned that as well in the El Obraje review, that maybe it would have been better to get something a little different from those two, but both just sounded like my type of coffee, and I was interested in both. So level 3 is where we opted to put that as well. We move on to one more level 3, which is the savoriness, level 3. That's entirely the tea-like aspects of this one, as this one was notably more tea-like than the El Obraje, which I feel like was fully expected given that it is a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the body there at the level 2. And I did mention that the El Obraje had a bit more texture, though truth be told, given that this coffee was brewed with a Chemex, I feel like it had a bit more texture than I was also expecting. When making the tasting wheel for these two coffees, I said, okay, I think that the El Obraje is just a little bit more textured, a little bit more body, but even this one being made with the Chemex is somewhat close, but it has a little less of it, so perhaps like a 2.5, but even then I decided to round down given that the El Obraje just had a bit more. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. The biggest takeaway I had from this one is that I regret not getting more coffees from this coffee roaster because the two that we did try were very nice, and the samples that I also had, which was the natural processed Elto, was also very nice. So I feel like it would have made it for some nice reviews to try out those coffees as well. As mentioned, there was a little bit of hesitancy in general, and I think that's mostly because we'd been reviewing a lot of coffees kind of blindly from coffee roasters that we didn't have any familiarity with and didn't know a lot about. And we were, I don't want to say burned, but some of those coffees weren't necessarily the best. And given that we had paid a little bit more of a luxury price for some of those coffees, it just kind of left a mixed reaction to how we wanted to approach this one. And in hindsight, I just wish I would have purchased more, and it's frustrating that you don't necessarily know how much you're going to enjoy a coffee roaster until you try them out. But it sounds like Oma will be back in the future at some point, so that will give us another opportunity to try out more of their coffees, given that the two that I did have from them I enjoyed. Granted, they are both in line with my own preferences, but this one right here was extremely nice for wash processed Ethiopian coffee. I say and complain a lot about reviewing washed Ethiopian coffees because usually they're a little bit too boring and tame and don't offer anything unique, and I wouldn't necessarily say that this coffee was unique. It was just a very nice representation of a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Type of person I would suggest this one to. If you do like the lighter profile classic Ethiopian characteristic, then this one has all of those in abundance. It's very clean, it's very sweet, it's very intense for a washed Ethiopian coffee. Great florality and great fruit profiles to it, especially within that stone fruit like scents, which all of those things are qualities that I look for in a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards in this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Elto, wash processed Ethiopia from Oma Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.